She's a billionaire heiress who just lost $20 million to a mysterious hacker. Furious, she tracks him down, but he's not just stealing her money, he's out to destroy her entire legacy. Now she's faced with an impossible choice: take him down or fall for him. This story has betrayal, revenge, and a twist you'll never see coming. Trust me, you're not ready for how this ends. I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you. Isabella Leclerc stood at the edge of her family's estate ballroom, casting a cool gaze over the crowd. Everywhere she looked, her life gleamed. The finest crystal chandeliers caught the light in brilliant facets, illuminating everything from the marble floor to the champagne glasses held by Boston's most influential people. This party was hers, just as the company her parents had built was hers now. She wore the Leclerc name with as much confidence as the velvet dress that hugged her frame. She was Isabella Leclerc, the heiress of Leclerc International, the face of an empire worth more than some countries, or so everyone thought. Izzy tucked a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear, smiling tightly as yet another guest toasted her success. Each word of praise only reminded her how hollow this evening felt. When her father died, leaving the company in her hands, she had promised herself she'd keep it thriving. Tonight should have felt like proof of her success. Yet, she couldn't shake the sense that it was all one big illusion. Then she felt it. The vibration. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She glanced down, irritation flickering through her. It wasn't the time for work emails. Not now. She'd silenced all notifications, except for urgent ones. Her breath hitched when she saw the sender, her CFO, Blake Kavanaugh. A single subject line glared back at her. Urgent. Account breach. Millions lost. She swallowed, feeling her stomach drop. Millions? She'd heard of phishing scams and hacks, sure. But Leclerc International wasn't some unprotected startup. They were practically Fort Knox when it came to cybersecurity. Shaken but resolute, Izzy slipped out of the ballroom and into a quiet hallway, tapping her phone as she went. The hallway's shadows seemed to grow, wrapping around her as her evening spiraled into darkness. Blake's text was short but horrifying. Isabella, we need to talk ASAP. It's bad. Very bad. Millions from our primary accounts, gone without a trace. It's working on it, but they don't know how it happened. We think it's an inside job. You need to see this. She bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. In the hours since her guests had raised their glasses to toast the empire, someone had been stealing it from under her nose. Izzy's heels clicked on the marble as she walked briskly toward her office down the hall, past portraits of the Leclerc family lineage. Her heart beat faster, matching the pace of her steps. Just when she thought she had everything under control, it felt like someone had lit a match and dropped it into her carefully constructed world. Once in her office, she called Blake, who picked up after a single ring. Izzy, you got my message, he said, his voice taut. Just tell me what happened. She gripped the edge of her desk, knuckles turning white. Hackers got into our accounts through some back door. Still don't know how they did it. It is tearing everything apart to find it, but they're saying it's sophisticated. Like government-level sophisticated. Blake's voice wavered. Izzy's grip on the desk tightened. She was used to numbers, contracts, boardroom arguments. But this was an entirely different battlefield. One where she didn't know the rules. Do we know anything about the hacker? She asked, voice low and steady, masking the storm churning inside her. Blake paused. A name popped up, but it could be an alias. Thorn. Whoever this guy is, he knew exactly where to hit us. Thorn, Izzy repeated, a shiver running down her spine. How much are we talking about here? Over 20 million so far. She felt the air leave her lungs. 20 million. The number was so big it felt impossible, like Monopoly money. Yet in that moment, she understood all too well just how real it was. Her empire wasn't as impenetrable as she'd believed, and someone out there, someone named Thorn, had broken through it as if it were made of glass. I'm flying out first thing tomorrow, she said, her voice like steel. Tell it to prepare every piece of data they have. I'm going to find this Thorn. Blake hesitated. Izzy, this guy isn't some amateur. He clearly has resources, skills beyond anything our team's dealt with. Then, I'll find someone who can deal with him, she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. She was a Leclerc, and no one, not even a faceless hacker, was going to bleed her family's legacy dry. After hanging up, she paced her office, the walls feeling suddenly closer. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was personal. Thorn hadn't just stolen money. He'd taken a piece of her, a chunk of her family's legacy, and she wanted it back, desperately. Finally, she sank into her chair, letting herself feel the full weight of her anger. As she sat there, simmering, the chandeliers in the ballroom twinkled faintly through her office door. The laughter and clinking glasses felt like a cruel mockery now. Her life, her power, everything she thought she controlled, had been shattered. And all because of one person, lurking somewhere in the shadows, grinning at his prize. Thorn, she whispered to the empty room. The name tasted bitter on her tongue. Whoever he was, wherever he was, he'd made one fatal mistake. He'd made it personal. Izzy had barely slept. By morning, the quiet early light filtered through her window as she scrolled through emails and updates from her team. Words like backdoor vulnerability and data breaches leaped off the screen, strange and alien to her world of brand strategies and boardroom politics. She leaned back, taking a breath. For all her composure, there was no denying it. She was in over her head. She glanced over at the stack of files on her desk, a jumble of paperwork Blake had sent over. Somewhere in that mess was supposed to be her way forward. But at the moment, all she had was a name. A haunting name that played on repeat in her mind like a song she couldn't shake. Thorn. She pulled her laptop closer, fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. She'd done her share of searching people online, but Thorn was a ghost, a shadow, leaving only faint traces of himself. Blake had warned her that this hacker was leagues ahead of what their company had faced before. But Izzy wasn't a person who took no for an answer. Not when someone had ripped away her sense of control. As she searched for any mention of this mysterious figure, she found only vague rumors on hacker forums. Comments dropped by anonymous users painted Thorn as some kind of renegade, a hacker with a code, someone who only went after the powerful and wealthy, leaving behind chaos. She found hints of past attacks, corrupt business executives with inexplicably drained accounts, fraudsters exposed in scandals that vanished overnight. The media had only whispers of him, rumors that drifted like smoke. Thorn was almost a legend among hackers, and now he was her personal nightmare. Ms. Leclerc? A soft knock sounded at her office door, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. She looked up to see Janice, her assistant, peeking in, her usual calm demeanor barely concealing the worry in her eyes. Blake is on the line for you. Izzy took a calming breath and picked up the phone, switching to speaker as she sifted through yet another file. Blake, I hope you have something for me. I do, he said, voice grave. It's unusual. It managed to trace one small part of the attack, a transaction rerouted through Amsterdam. It could be a red herring, but… Amsterdam? She repeated, her mind racing. Thorn's there? Possibly, but it could be a false trail he left to throw us off. Still, it's the only lead we've got. Izzy's jaw tightened. She glanced at the pile of reports, and then at the photo on her desk of her father, a constant reminder of the legacy she was responsible for. This wasn't just her battle. It was her family's, her company's. This hacker had taken something precious from her, and now, finally, she had somewhere to start. Without giving herself more time to think, she stood up. Blake, I want all details on this transfer sent to me immediately. I'm taking the next flight to Amsterdam. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Izzy, are you sure that's a good idea? You could be stepping into something dangerous. This guy isn't your typical cyber thief. Izzy's voice was ice. I don't care. I won't just sit here and let this Thorn tear apart everything my family built. She hung up before Blake could protest further, adrenaline coursing through her veins as she moved through her penthouse, throwing clothes and essentials into a small suitcase. There was an exhilaration in the urgency of it all, a chance to finally take action. She'd spent her whole life working within her carefully polished world, but this felt wild, unpredictable. And that, she realized with a twinge of surprise, was exactly what she craved. The plane touched down in Amsterdam under a pale gray sky, and Izzy felt the energy of the city wash over her. Here, she was just another person in a crowd. No press hounding her, no weight of family legacy pulling at her shoulders. She could be anonymous, if only for a moment, and the feeling was both liberating and unsettling. Her hotel was a modest choice by her usual standards, but she'd picked it for discretion. The last thing she needed was a wave of paparazzi following her as she hunted down a hacker. After checking in, she set up her makeshift command center on the small desk by the window, pulling up everything Blake and IT had sent her. Pages of numbers, IP addresses, and transaction codes swirled before her, like a complex, taunting puzzle. Hours passed as she pieced through the information. Frustration seeped in, thick and cloying, but she forced herself to stay calm. Just when her patience was thinning, she noticed a small detail, a pattern in the transaction codes, one she recognized from her own company's encrypted systems. Thorne had hacked into Leclerc's accounts through a specific loophole she'd overseen during a recent acquisition. It was almost as if he knew exactly where to hit her. That made her pulse quicken. This wasn't just some random act. Thorne had targeted her, her family. But why? A knock on her door pulled her out of her thoughts. Startled, she got up, crossing the room and peering through the peephole. A hotel staff member stood outside, holding a small envelope with her name on it. "Ms. Leclerc?" he asked, handing her the envelope. Izzy took it, nodding, and shut the door behind her. Inside, a single piece of paper bore a short, typed message. "I know you're looking for me, Isabella. Meet me at the cafe by the canals tonight, 9 p.m. She stared at the note, heart racing, as she traced the bold signature at the bottom. Thorne. The audacity of it almost made her laugh. He was taunting her, toying with her. For a moment, a sliver of doubt snaked through her mind. What if he was dangerous? What if she was stepping into something far bigger than a simple revenge scheme? But her doubts vanished as quickly as they'd come. She hadn't flown halfway across the world to back down now. Izzy glanced at the clock. 7 p.m. She had 2 hours until the meeting, just enough time to prepare. She threw on her coat and wrapped herself in a scarf, her heart hammering with an unfamiliar mixture of fear and excitement. Tonight, she'd finally confront the man who had turned her life upside down. The Canal Café was tucked between narrow brick buildings, bathed in the dim glow of Amsterdam's streetlights. Izzy adjusted her scarf, pulling it tighter around her neck as she scanned the tables. People were scattered around, some huddled over coffee mugs, others murmuring in languages she didn't recognize. It was a cold night, but her pulse throbbed with warmth and adrenaline. And then, she saw him. A figure sat at a table in the far corner, shadowed and still. He wore a black coat, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, his face obscured by the dim light. But there was an intensity about him, a quiet watchfulness that made her pulse race. She didn't know what she'd expected Thorne to look like, but this man had a calm confidence that rattled her. Izzy took a breath, squared her shoulders, and walked toward him. Each step was deliberate, a small battle cry as she closed the distance between them. "Isabella Leclerc," he said as she approached, his voice smooth and deep, with an accent she couldn't place. There was no hint of surprise. He'd been waiting for her. "Thorne," she replied, trying to sound cool, unbothered. But the truth was, she was anything but calm. Here she was, face to face with the man who'd ripped through her life, left her empire bleeding. And he was smiling. "Please, sit," he offered, gesturing to the chair across from him. Izzy hesitated, but she wasn't about to let him think he'd unnerved her. She took the seat, folding her hands in her lap to steady them. "You're awfully polite for someone who's stolen millions from my family." He leaned back, amusement dancing in his dark eyes. "Polite? That's not something I've been called in a long time." His gaze was sharp, assessing her with an intensity that felt like he was peeling back layers she hadn't meant to reveal. "You came all the way to Amsterdam for a chat? Or is this just part of the Leclerc revenge package?" Her jaw tightened. "I came here for answers. 20 million answers, to be precise." He laughed softly, a low, unsettling sound. "I thought you'd be more original. If money's all you care about, you might be disappointed." She clenched her fists under the table, forcing herself to hold his gaze. He was challenging her, baiting her, and it was working. "Why did you do it?" she demanded, voice barely above a whisper. "I know this isn't just about money. You could have targeted anyone. Why me?" A shadow flickered over his face, a hint of something darker, more complicated than she'd expected. He looked away, his fingers drumming softly against the table. "Maybe I wanted to shake things up," he said. "Maybe I thought someone like you could stand to lose a little." Izzy's eyes narrowed. "So, this is some kind of twisted moral crusade? You're punishing me for being born into wealth?" His gaze snapped back to her, and she felt the full force of his intensity. Do you have any idea what your family's empire has done? The lives it's wrecked, the people it's left in the dust? Izzy felt the heat rise in her cheeks, indignation flaring. My family built something. They created jobs, opportunities. They crushed competitors. He cut in, his voice a harsh whisper. Swallowed up small businesses, left whole communities floundering. You think money and power come without a cost? The accusations stung. She knew her family's business wasn't perfect, but hearing it from him felt personal, like a knife twisting in her chest. So what? You see yourself as some kind of vigilante? She asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Taking down the big bad corporations? His lips curved into a smirk, but there was a sadness in his eyes, something heavy and worn. Believe what you want, Isabella. You think I'm some monster? Maybe I am, but I know what it's like to be on the other side of power, to watch people lose everything because someone at the top decides their lives don't matter. For a moment, she felt a flicker of doubt. Who was this man, really? He'd stolen from her, yes, but there was something in his voice that sounded almost wounded, as if he'd seen too much, felt too much. But she pushed the sympathy aside, reminding herself of the betrayal, the chaos he'd caused. You still haven't answered my question, she pressed, her voice softer now. Why me? He looked down, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. You're right, this wasn't random, he admitted, voice laced with bitterness. Years ago, my father lost everything, his business, his dignity, all because he got in the way of a LeClaire expansion. He was small, insignificant to people like you, and when he couldn't keep up, he lost everything. So yeah, maybe I wanted to hit back. Izzy's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected the story to be so human. She'd imagined Thorn as a shadow, a phantom who existed only to dismantle her life. But now, sitting across from him, she saw the anger in his eyes, the hurt beneath it. She swallowed, her voice gentler now. I didn't know. He looked up, his gaze sharp, challenging. You don't get to hide behind I didn't know. You have power, Isabella. Use it wisely, or one day it'll come crashing down and you'll have no one to blame but yourself. Silence settled between them, thick and charged. For the first time, Izzy felt something beyond anger, beyond the icy disdain she'd held onto since he'd hacked her accounts. She felt respect, maybe even a strange admiration for the man who dared to stand against everything she represented. But she wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet. I won't pretend to understand your choices, Thorn, she said, voice firm. But you don't know me. You don't know my life or what I stand for. You're making assumptions because of my last name. He tilted his head, a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. Then show me who you are, Isabella. Prove me wrong. Her breath caught. He'd thrown down a challenge, and something about it thrilled her. She didn't want to back down, didn't want to let him walk away with the satisfaction of thinking he'd rattled her. She wanted to prove him wrong, to make him see her as more than a name, more than a figure on a balance sheet. She leaned forward, eyes steady. Maybe I will, she said, her voice daring. But I want my money back, every last cent. He laughed, the sound rich and unexpected. I'll make you a deal, he said, a spark of mischief in his eyes. You show me a LeClaire who isn't all about money and power, and maybe I'll consider it. Izzy's pulse quickened. She didn't know what game he was playing, but she was hooked. Fine, but don't think for a second that I'm letting you off the hook. Wouldn't dream of it. He stood, tossing a few euros onto the table. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Isabella. With that, he disappeared into the night, leaving her alone at the table, her mind reeling. She watched the spot where he'd stood, trying to process everything he'd said, the fire in his eyes, the challenge he'd laid down at her feet. Izzy had come here to confront a criminal. Instead, she'd found a man whose scars ran as deep as her own, a man who'd forced her to question everything she'd believed about her family's legacy. And though she hated to admit it, a small part of her was intrigued. As she rose from her chair, she felt a strange thrill course through her veins. She was still angry, yes, but underneath the anger, something else simmered. A challenge, an invitation. Whatever game Nico Thorn was playing, she intended to beat him at it. Izzy couldn't shake the memory of their conversation. Thorn's words echoed in her mind, sharp and unsettling, as she walked through the crowded Amsterdam streets the next morning. She was supposed to be furious, He'd stolen her family's money, pried open her world as if it were some open book. And yet, a small part of her felt alive. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was doing something real, something unpredictable. As she made her way to a small coffee shop she'd found that overlooked one of the canals, Izzy tried to clear her head. She didn't come to Amsterdam to play games with a thief. She came here to reclaim her legacy. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Blake. Any progress? It says Thorne used an encrypted route to siphon the funds out. They're still tracking it, but he covered his tracks well. We might need outside help. Izzy frowned. Outside help was precisely what she was here for, even if Blake didn't know it yet. She typed back quickly, "Working on it. Keep me updated." As she slipped her phone back into her pocket, she glanced up and froze. Across the street, leaning casually against the wrought iron railing of the canal bridge, was Thorne. He was watching her. Her heart skipped, a sudden rush of anger mingling with something she couldn't quite name. She should be calling the police, reporting his exact location. But instead, she felt herself rooted in place, unable to look away. With a casual nod, he motioned her over. She hesitated, her mind screaming at her to turn around and leave, to avoid whatever mind game he was about to play. But her feet had other ideas. She crossed the street, her gaze locked on his, and approached him. "Following me now, are we?" she asked, trying to sound unaffected, though her pulse hammered in her ears. He smirked, looking infuriatingly at ease. "Hardly. I knew you'd be here." Izzy narrowed her eyes. "Do you always stalk the people you rob, or am I special?" He chuckled, and the sound was maddeningly self-assured. "Special, I think," he said, his voice a quiet rumble, "though I get the feeling you'd prefer the term exceptional." She crossed her arms, glaring up at him. "Flattery doesn't suit you, Thorne. Or should I say, Nico?" The flicker in his eyes told her she'd hit a nerve. Finally, a crack in the mask. He raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Digging up my name already? I'm impressed." Izzy's confidence wavered for a second. She hadn't been sure if her sources were right about his identity, but his reaction told her everything she needed to know. Nico Thorne. It suited him, in a dangerous, unpredictable way. "Why are you here?" she demanded. "If you've already stolen the money, what do you want with me?" He sighed, his gaze drifting to the canal, where small boats drifted lazily by. "Maybe I just like watching you squirm." She clenched her jaw. "I don't squirm." He laughed, shaking his head. "You really don't know, do you? You're walking around, clutching that last name like a shield, thinking it gives you power, thinking it makes you untouchable." Izzy bristled, her hands balling into fists. "I've worked for everything I have," she said, voice tight. "Don't assume you know me because of where I come from." He met her gaze, and for a moment his expression softened. "I'm not assuming anything. I know exactly what it's like to have everything and then lose it all. To be stripped down to nothing and left to find your own way." His words lingered in the chilly morning air, and Izzy felt her defenses slip, just for a second. She'd spent so long defending her family's legacy that she rarely thought about the costs, the people who may have suffered along the way. But she pushed the doubt aside, reminding herself that he was the one in the wrong here. "So that's it?" she asked. "This is all just revenge for your father's business?" He shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just giving people like you a taste of what it's like to feel powerless." Her anger flared, but instead of lashing out, she surprised herself by laughing, a dry, humorless sound. "And you think stealing my family's money makes you some kind of hero?" His eyes sparkled with something between amusement and challenge. "Hero? No, I don't pretend to be one of the good guys. But someone has to even the playing field, don't you think?" Izzy's gaze flickered over him, studying the lines of his face, the hard edges softened only slightly by a faint scruff of stubble. There was something broken in him, something driven and dangerous. He wasn't a thief in it for the thrill, nor a vigilante out to save the world. He was something else, someone forged by pain and anger, someone who saw the world in shades of black and gray. "Why me, though?" she asked quietly. "Why target me specifically?" He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you're different. I thought you'd understand. I wanted to see if you'd stand up for yourself, or if you'd crumble like the rest of them." Izzy held his gaze, feeling a strange sense of kinship, as though he saw her in a way no one else had, and that terrified her. But it also thrilled her. "So what now?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "You've made your point. You can leave me and my company alone." Nico's smirk returned, the familiar gleam of mischief in his eyes. "Leave? Oh, Isabella. I think we're just getting started." Before she could react, he stepped back, slipping into the crowd like a shadow. She tried to follow him, but he was gone, lost in the throngs of tourists and locals along the canal. Frustration prickled at her as she scanned the crowd, but he'd vanished without a trace. Izzy stood there, her heart pounding, feeling as though she'd just lost a game she hadn't even realized they were playing. Nico Thorne wasn't just a hacker. He was something far more elusive, a ghost who could disappear at will, leaving her with more questions than answers. She walked back to her hotel, the weight of their conversation pressing on her. For the first time, she wondered if her family's empire wasn't as untouchable as she'd believed. Nico had cracked the walls of her life effortlessly, slipping inside her mind, her heart, and her carefully curated world with ease. As she climbed the stairs to her room, she felt something shift within her, a quiet determination, an undeniable need to prove him wrong. Nico had set this in motion, but she would be the one to finish it, and as much as she hated to admit it, she was looking forward to the next round. Izzy's days in Amsterdam turned into a whirlwind chase that left her breathless and frustrated. Everywhere she went, it felt like Nico had just slipped through her fingers, leaving behind only hints of his presence. A lingering look from a stranger, a note scribbled on a napkin, a text message that disappeared the second she read it. He was toying with her, and she knew it. And though it infuriated her, there was a thrill to it too, a strange exhilaration in the game. She'd spent her life surrounded by people who always told her what she wanted to hear, who respected her because they feared her family's power. But Nico Thorne saw her differently. He wasn't afraid of her. If anything, he seemed to be daring her to keep up with him. One evening, she found herself at a small, dimly lit jazz bar he'd mentioned in one of his mysterious messages. The place was tucked away in a corner of the city, hidden from the usual tourist spots, as if only locals or those with an invitation could find it. Izzy pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the room. Soft jazz played in the background, filling the air with a sultry, rhythmic pulse that matched the hum of her own racing heartbeat. She took a seat at the bar, ordering a drink and trying to blend into the shadows as she waited, hoping he'd reveal himself. But after half an hour, there was no sign of him. Her glass sat half empty in front of her, and she was starting to feel foolish. Had she really thought he'd just walk in and sit down across from her, like some scripted drama? Nico was too elusive for that. He was more of a phantom, slipping through the cracks of her world and vanishing before she could catch him. Just as she was about to leave, her phone buzzed with a new message. She opened it, half expecting another cryptic taunt. "Look to your left." Her head snapped to the side, and there he was, seated at a table in the far corner, watching her with that calm, infuriating smile. She hadn't even seen him come in. She pushed her drink aside and walked over, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. Her heart pounded with a mix of irritation and excitement. When she reached his table, she sat down without waiting for an invitation. "You enjoy this, don't you?" she asked, leaning forward. "The chase, the games, the mystery." He chuckled, unbothered by her bluntness. "Maybe I do," he replied, eyes glinting with mischief. "Or maybe I just enjoy seeing how far you're willing to go to catch me." She clenched her fists under the table, refusing to let him see her flustered. "You're arrogant," she shot back, her tone sharp. "And you think you're untouchable, don't you?" Nico shrugged, a half smile curving his lips. "Arrogant? Perhaps. Untouchable? I guess we'll see." There was a challenge in his gaze, one that stirred something inside her. Something that both scared and intrigued her. She was used to men trying to impress her, trying to win her favor. But Nico was different. He wasn't trying to win anything from her. If anything, he was daring her to confront him, to keep pushing and prying until she found the answers she wanted. "Why don't you just tell me what you're after?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why all the games?" He leaned in, his face close enough that she could feel his warmth, his breath mingling with hers. "Because," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "It's the only way to get your attention." Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't know whether to slap him or pull him closer, and the confusion left her off balance, caught between anger and a strange pull she couldn't ignore. Nico leaned back, watching her carefully. "I know you think I'm the bad guy here," he continued, his tone softer, almost thoughtful. "And maybe I am. But this isn't just about the money, Izzy. This is about showing people like you that power has limits, that wealth doesn't make you invincible." Izzy swallowed, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "And what exactly makes you the one to decide that?" He tilted his head, considering her. "Maybe it's not about deciding. Maybe it's just about leveling the playing field." She shook her head, unwilling to let him distract her. "Then why all this?" she asked, gesturing around the dim bar. "Why not just take what you want and disappear?" A shadow crossed his face, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something deeper, something raw and vulnerable beneath his polished exterior. "Maybe I wanted to see if you'd fight back," he admitted. "To see if you were more than just another heiress." His words hung between them, heavy and charged, and Izzy felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Anger, yes, but also a strange sense of respect. He wasn't just a thief or a hacker. He was someone who'd fought his own battles, who understood the stakes in a way that few people in her life ever had. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the tension thickening like a gathering storm. She could feel his gaze on her, warm and intense, and she found herself wondering what he was thinking, what he saw when he looked at her. Did he see a woman caught between two worlds? A woman fighting to prove herself in a world that expected her to fail? Or did he see something else, something darker, something she hadn't even seen in herself yet? Finally, Nico stood, breaking the silence. "It's been a pleasure, Isabella," he said, his voice low and smooth. "But our time here is up." She blinked, surprised by the sudden shift. "What do you mean?" He smiled, that infuriating, enigmatic smile. "You'll see," he said simply, slipping past her and disappearing into the crowd before she could stop him. Izzy felt a rush of frustration, mingling with a strange, unwelcome sense of loss. She'd come so close, felt herself on the brink of understanding him, of peeling back the layers he so carefully hid behind. But once again, he'd left her chasing shadows. As she walked back to her hotel through the quiet, empty streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Nico had ignited something in her, a spark of defiance, of curiosity, of something that felt dangerously close to admiration. He'd shown her a side of herself she hadn't known existed, a side that craved the thrill of the chase, the challenge of confronting someone who saw right through her polished exterior. For the first time in her life, Isabella Leclerc felt as though she'd met her match. Izzy paced the length of her hotel room, her mind replaying every word, every glance Nico had thrown her way during their last encounter. It felt maddening, like trying to piece together a puzzle where half the pieces were missing. Each time she thought she understood him, he vanished, leaving her with more questions than answers. She was exhausted, yet sleep was the last thing on her mind. The man had gotten under her skin, lodged there like a splinter she couldn't ignore. She barely noticed when her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Snatching it up, she saw a new message from an unknown number. She knew it was him before she even opened it. "Meet me at the old library off the canal at midnight. No games this time, just answers." Her heart pounded as she read and reread the message. The words, "no games," echoed in her mind, both a promise and a challenge. Part of her wanted to ignore him, to leave Amsterdam and cut her losses, but another part, a much stronger part, needed to know, needed to understand this man who saw right through her, who challenged her in ways no one else had. By midnight, Izzy was waiting outside the library, the quiet street lit only by a single street lamp casting long shadows over the cobblestone. She wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders, scanning the darkened windows and arched doorways, half expecting him to emerge from the shadows like some phantom. She was tense, her nerves strung tight as a bow, but she was determined to stay calm, to finally get the answers he promised. Footsteps sounded behind her, and she turned to see Nico approaching, hands in his pockets, his gaze steady and calm. He moved with a confidence that was almost unnerving, as if the world around him shifted to accommodate his presence. When he stopped in front of her, he held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Isabella," he greeted her quietly, with none of the playful edge she was used to. Tonight, he was different, serious, almost solemn. "Nico," she replied, mirroring his tone. "I'm here. Now talk." He glanced toward the library door, nodding for her to follow him inside. Izzy hesitated, but she wasn't about to back down now. She followed him into the dimly lit building, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor as they moved through the rows of bookshelves, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Finally, they stopped in a quiet corner, hidden from view. Nico turned to face her, his gaze intense. "You want to know why I did it?" he began, his voice low and even. "Why I targeted you, out of all the wealthy people in the world?" "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to know why you're so determined to tear me down." He took a breath, his gaze distant, as if he were remembering something painful. "Years ago, my father ran a small tech company. He was a good man, honest, hardworking. But he was also a dreamer, someone who believed that innovation should be about improving people's lives, not just lining the pockets of the powerful." Izzy felt a pang of sympathy, though she kept her face neutral, waiting for him to continue. "But the bigger companies, the ones like Leclerc International, they didn't see it that way," he said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. "They saw his business as a threat. He was standing in the way of one of your family's acquisitions, so they pushed him out, left him with nothing. And when he tried to fight back, they crushed him. He lost everything, his business, his reputation, his health. He died a broken man, and no one cared." Izzy swallowed, her throat tight. She wanted to defend her family, to tell him that not every decision was hers, that she wasn't responsible for every choice her company made. But his story hit too close to home. She knew, deep down, that there was truth in his words, that her family's empire wasn't built without casualties. "Nico, I didn't know," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I can't imagine what you went through, what your father went through, but that doesn't justify what you did to me, to my family." He looked at her, his expression softening just slightly. "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I wanted you to understand. I wanted you to feel what it's like to have something taken from you, to be powerless against forces beyond your control." She felt her anger flare again, mixing with the sympathy she couldn't quite shake. "You think this is some kind of lesson?" she asked, her voice rising. "You think you can just waltz into my life, steal from me, and then preach about justice?" Nico's gaze hardened. "This isn't about justice, Isabella. It's about survival. People like you have always had the upper hand. You've never had to fight for anything, never had to worry about losing everything because of someone else's greed." The words hit her like a punch, each one carrying a weight she hadn't felt before. He wasn't wrong. She'd lived her life in a bubble, protected by her family's wealth, shielded from the harsh realities that others faced every day. And in his eyes, she could see the toll it had taken on him, the scars he bore from a lifetime of struggling against a system that had favored her. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the air thick with tension. And then, without thinking, she reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. "Nico," she said softly, the anger fading from her voice. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to make things right." He looked down at her hand on his arm, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" "I don't know yet," she admitted, dropping her hand, feeling vulnerable in a way she wasn't used to. "But I don't want this to be the end. I don't want to be your enemy, Nico. Not anymore." A strange look crossed his face, a mix of hope and hesitation. For a moment, he looked almost lost, as if he weren't sure what to do with the olive branch she was extending. "I never wanted you to be my enemy," he said quietly, his voice softening. "I just wanted you to see things from my side, to understand why people like me have no choice but to fight." Izzy felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't expected this fragile, tentative truce that felt as delicate as glass, as if one wrong word could shatter it completely. And yet, she wanted it, wanted to believe that there was a way forward, a way to bridge the chasm between them. "Nico," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "maybe we can find a way to fix this. Together." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something close to vulnerability in his eyes. "Maybe," he murmured, his gaze locked on hers. "But this isn't going to be easy." She took a step closer, her pulse quickening. "I don't care," she whispered, her voice steady. "For once in my life, I want to fight for something real. I want to fight for you." The words hung between them, raw and unguarded. And then, slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached out, his hand finding hers. His fingers were warm, grounding her in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Their gazes met, and in that moment, she felt the world narrow to just the two of them, as if everything else had faded away. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if this fragile connection would survive the storm ahead, but for the first time, she felt something real, something worth fighting for. And as they stood there, hand in hand, she knew that whatever happened, she was ready to face it. The next morning, Izzy awoke with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. Last night with Nico had shaken her, stripped away layers of her identity she hadn't even realized she was hiding behind. She'd always believed in the legacy she was carrying forward, the Leclerc name, and all the wealth and power it commanded. But now, she saw her world through different eyes. After slipping out of the hotel's back entrance, Izzy wandered through Amsterdam's quiet streets, her thoughts swirling with all that Nico had said about her family's empire. Part of her wanted to resist, to deny that her family's success came at the cost of people like Nico and his father. But another part, a deeper, humbler part, knew there was truth in his words. A few hours later, as she returned to her hotel, she felt her phone buzz. It was a message from Nico. "Meet me at the museum cafe at noon. Let's talk about next steps." Izzy felt a small thrill at the thought of seeing him again, though she knew better than to show it. She had made a decision. If she was going to change things, if she was going to reshape her family's legacy, she needed Nico's insight, even if it meant pushing herself far outside her comfort zone. By noon, she was seated at a small, secluded table in the museum's bustling cafe. Nico arrived a few minutes later, slipping into the chair across from her. He was dressed more casually than she'd seen him before, a simple jacket over a dark sweater, but his presence was no less intense. He gave her a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "You came," he said simply, as if her being there was somehow surprising. "I don't make promises I can't keep," she replied, her voice steady. "I told you, I want to make things right." Nico studied her, his dark eyes scanning her face as though searching for any hint of insincerity. "So, what exactly does that mean, Isabella? Making things right?" She leaned forward, her voice a quiet murmur. "I want to help the people my family's company has affected. I want to find a way to balance what we've built with a responsibility to those we've harmed, and I need your help to do it." He arched an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "You really think you can change a legacy as massive as Leclerc? Your family has spent generations amassing wealth and power, making decisions that serve them. One person can't just turn that around." She lifted her chin, a spark of defiance in her gaze. "Maybe I can't fix everything overnight, but I can start. And I don't need you to believe in me. I just need you to trust that I'm serious." He let out a low chuckle, though there was no humor in his eyes. "Trust isn't exactly something I hand out easily." Izzy felt a pang at his words, a reminder of the walls he still kept up, the secrets he hadn't yet shared. She knew there was more to his story than he'd revealed, that his father's downfall was only part of the pain that fueled his actions. But she also knew she couldn't push him, not yet. "Then consider this a partnership," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "You have insights I don't. You understand the people who've been hurt by corporations like mine. Help me, and maybe we can find a way forward together." For a moment, Nico looked almost vulnerable, as if her offer had struck a nerve. But just as quickly, the mask was back in place, his expression guarded. "Fine," he said at last, his voice low. "We'll see where this goes. But don't think for a second that I'll be easy on you. If you're serious about changing things, you'll have to prove it." Izzy's heart skipped a beat, a thrill of excitement running through her. I wouldn't expect anything less. They spent the next few days moving through the city together, Nico taking her to places she never would have ventured alone. They visited neighborhoods where small business owners struggled to survive, places where people fought every day against the tide of gentrification and corporate expansion. With each encounter, Izzy's understanding of her world deepened, her perspective shifting in ways she hadn't anticipated. But as their connection grew, so did the unspoken tension between them. Every glance, every accidental brush of his hand against hers left her breathless, her heart racing with a dangerous mix of curiosity and longing. She was drawn to him, captivated by his intensity, his fire, his willingness to fight for a cause he believed in, even if it meant walking the edges of the law. One night, as they walked back to her hotel after a long day of meetings, Izzy finally worked up the nerve to ask the question that had been lingering in her mind. "Nico," she began, her voice soft, Why did you really target me? You said it was about my family's impact, but is there more to it? He glanced over at her, his jaw tense, his gaze unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might brush her off, but then he sighed, stopping in his tracks. There's always more, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My father. He wasn't the only one who suffered. My mother left when things got bad. She took my little sister with her, and I haven't seen them since. They didn't want any part of my father's fight, so they disappeared, and I had no one, except for a grudge against people like your family. Izzy's heart clenched, her throat tight as she absorbed his words. She'd assumed Nico's pain was rooted in his father's loss, but now she saw that it went deeper than that he'd been left alone to fend for himself, fueled only by his anger and a need to make someone pay. Nico, she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. I'm so sorry. I can't imagine what that must have been like. He tensed under her touch, his expression hardening. Don't pity me, Isabella. I don't need sympathy. I'm not pitying you, she replied, her tone firm. I'm trying to understand you, to see you the way you are, not just the man who hacked my accounts or made my life difficult. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the night air thick with unspoken tension. And then, to her surprise, Nico's hand reached for hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture so simple, yet so profound that it left her breathless. I don't know what this is, Isabella, he murmured, his voice barely audible, but I know it's dangerous. She felt her heart pound, her hand warm in his. I think I can handle a little danger. He gave a small, reluctant smile, but his gaze remained intense, searching hers as if looking for some unspoken answer. Then we're in this together, he said softly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture so tender that it nearly undid her. In that moment, they were bound by something deeper than a partnership, something that transcended their differences, their pasts. They were bound by the weight of secrets, of pain, of a connection that was as fragile as it was undeniable. And for the first time, Izzy felt like she'd found something worth fighting for. Not just her family's legacy, not just redemption, but a chance to rebuild something real, something honest, with the only person who'd ever truly seen her. Izzy hadn't realized how much she'd let her guard down until it was too late. The days spent with Nico had lulled her into a fragile sense of trust, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see her as more than just a Leclerc, more than just a convenient target. But trust, she was about to learn, was a double-edged sword. The morning started with a message on her phone, marked urgent, and sent from Blake back home. She barely had a chance to open it before a second message followed. This one from Nico. Meet me at the pier. There's something I need to show you. Izzy frowned, feeling a pang of unease. She hadn't heard from Nico since the night before, when they'd shared a quiet dinner in a cozy little cafe overlooking the canal. She'd thought they'd reached a new understanding, a deeper level of connection. But now, as she read his message, something felt off. Taking a deep breath, she brushed aside her doubts and left the hotel, pulling her coat tighter around her as she made her way to the pier. The sky was a steely gray, clouds hanging low over the water, casting everything in a cool, muted light. She spotted Nico waiting for her at the edge of the dock, hands shoved in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. As she approached, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Thanks for coming, he said quietly. You said it was urgent, she replied, studying him. What's going on, Nico? He glanced away, his jaw tight, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. There's something I haven't told you, Izzy. Something I should have told you from the beginning. A chill ran down her spine. What do you mean? He took a step closer, his gaze heavy with a mix of regret and guilt. This wasn't supposed to happen, he said, his voice low. You weren't supposed to mean anything to me. Izzy's chest tightened. She felt the edges of her world begin to crumble, her pulse quickening as the weight of his words sank in. What are you saying, Nico? He held her gaze, his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place. I lied to you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This whole time, I was using you. To get to your family. To get deeper into Leclerc's accounts. You were never supposed to find out. The words hit her like a blow, each one sharper than the last. She stared at him, her mind reeling, trying to process what he was saying. You were using me?" He looked away, shame flickering across his face. At first, yes, that was the plan. But things changed, Izzy. I didn't expect to feel this way. A cold, bitter laugh escaped her. So what? You're saying you had a change of heart? That suddenly you grew a conscience? He winced, his expression twisting with guilt. I know it sounds like an excuse. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but you're asking for it anyway? Her voice cracked, the betrayal cutting deeper than she'd ever imagined it could. She'd let herself believe in him, let herself feel something real, something she hadn't felt in years. And now, all of it had been shattered by the truth. "I never meant to hurt you," he murmured, his voice rough. "Izzy, you have to believe that." She shook her head, anger flaring in her chest. "Believe you? After everything? After the lies, the manipulation? You think I can just forget all of that because you say you never meant to hurt me?" He took a step closer, his eyes desperate. "Izzy, please. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was supposed to walk away, but you didn't," she snapped, cutting him off. "You stayed. You let me believe you cared. And all along, you were just waiting to pull the rug out from under me." Her voice shook with the weight of her anger, her pain. She'd trusted him, opened herself up to him in ways she'd never dared with anyone else. And now, standing here, she felt foolish, exposed, as if he'd ripped away the very foundation she'd been standing on. "Izzy," he whispered, reaching for her hand. But she pulled away, her gaze cold. "You don't get to call me that. You don't get to act like any of this meant anything to you." A heavy silence fell between them, the air thick with words left unsaid. She wanted to lash out, to scream, to make him feel the hurt she was drowning in. But instead she turned away, swallowing down the tears that threatened to spill. "Goodbye, Nico," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you got what you wanted." Without waiting for a response, she walked away, leaving him standing alone on the pier. She didn't look back, didn't let herself see the regret in his eyes, the pain that mirrored her own. She couldn't bear it. Back at the hotel, Izzy collapsed onto her bed, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her. Every memory, every moment she'd shared with him felt tainted now, like poison spreading through her veins. She'd let herself believe that he was different, that he was someone worth fighting for. But now, all she could feel was the sting of her own naivety. Her phone buzzed again with a message from Blake, but she ignored it, too numb to care about whatever work crisis awaited her. Instead, she lay there, staring at the ceiling, letting the tears fall as the walls of her world closed in around her. Hours passed, the ache settling deep in her chest, filling every corner of her being. She wanted to scream, to rage, to do anything to purge the hurt, but all she could do was lie there, letting the pain wash over her. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke through the window, she sat up, her face set with a grim determination. She was done letting Nico Thorne have power over her, done letting his betrayal define her. It was time to take back control, to rebuild her world from the ashes he'd left behind. And as she wiped the last of the tears from her eyes, she knew one thing for certain. Nico might have won this round, but the game was far from over. The days following Nico's betrayal were a blur of anger and hurt. Izzy kept herself busy, throwing every ounce of her energy into work, meetings, and late-night calls with her team back home. She wanted to drown out the pain, to bury it beneath the weight of responsibility. But no matter how hard she tried, his words haunted her, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. She missed the Nico she thought she'd known, the man who had seen her as more than a name, more than an heiress. One evening, after another long call with her legal team, she found herself standing in front of the hotel window, staring out at the city lights reflected in the canals below. The same thought kept replaying in her mind, a question that refused to leave her alone. Why had he told her the truth? He could have easily disappeared, left her none the wiser. Instead, he'd faced her, knowing the cost. The truth, painful as it was, left her conflicted. There was something in Nico's eyes, a rawness, an apology that felt too real to ignore. Despite herself, she could still feel the warmth of his hand on hers, the gentleness behind his words when he'd told her about his family. She knew that part of him cared, or at least wanted to. But was that enough? Just then her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was Nico. For a long moment, she stared at his name, her heart pounding. She should delete the message, erase him from her life entirely. But her fingers seemed to have a mind of their own, and before she knew it, she'd opened the message. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from right now," it read, "but I need to see you. There's something I need to explain." 1,000 emotions surged within her. Anger, confusion, and, despite everything, a flicker of hope. She told herself it was foolish, that she'd already heard enough. And yet, part of her needed closure, needed to understand why he'd gone to such lengths to pull her into his world, only to betray her. With a resigned sigh, she typed a response. "Meet me tomorrow at the park near the Rijksmuseum. Noon." The next day, Izzy arrived at the park early, the winter air crisp and sharp as she found a bench and sat down, crossing her arms tightly against the cold. She watched people pass by, laughing and chatting, living their lives with a simplicity she envied. In her world, every relationship came with strings, every connection tangled with expectation and duty. Nico arrived a few minutes later, his face drawn, shoulders tense. He walked toward her slowly, hands in his coat pockets, as if he weren't sure she'd stay. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with things unsaid. Finally, he broke the quiet. "Thank you for meeting me." She looked up at him, her face unreadable. "I don't know why I did," she admitted. "I don't even know what you could say to make any of this better." He nodded, a shadow passing over his face. "I understand. I wouldn't forgive me either." She let his words hang in the air, her heart pounding as she waited for him to continue. "I wanted you to know that this was never just about the money," he said quietly. "At first, yes, I was angry. I wanted to hurt your family, to get revenge for what they did to mine. But then I met you, and things changed." She crossed her arms tighter, a defense against the vulnerability creeping in. "You used me, Nico. You let me believe you cared." "I know," he whispered, regret thick in his voice. "And that's something I'll have to live with. But Izzy, I do care. More than I ever thought possible. And I'm sorry I didn't realize it sooner, before I made everything worse." She looked away, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man she'd let herself care for still existed, that he hadn't been a figment of her imagination. "You keep saying you're sorry, but words don't fix what you did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't get to just walk away from this." He nodded, a pained look in his eyes. "I know, and I'm not asking for forgiveness, Izzy. I wanted you to know that I'm going to make things right, however I can." She looked at him, skepticism flickering in her gaze. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I've been working with a journalist. She's been helping me collect information on corporate corruption, on companies like yours, companies that hurt people like my family. But I told her I'm done, that I won't go forward with my story. I'm not going to use what I found against you or your family. Not anymore." Her eyes widened, surprise softening her anger for a moment. "You'd do that?" He nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, because you're right. What I did was wrong. I thought hurting you would give me some kind of justice, but all it did was hurt the one person who ever truly saw me." For a long moment, she stared at him, her heart caught between hope and doubt. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the regret that mirrored her own pain. And though she wanted to hold on to her anger, to protect herself from further hurt, she couldn't ignore the small flicker of warmth that stirred within her. She looked away, taking a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Nico. But I can't hate you either. I tried, but..." He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "Izzy, I know I don't deserve a second chance. But if there's any part of you that still believes in me, please, let me prove that I'm worthy of it." Her heart pounded, her mind racing as she considered his words. She wanted to be strong, to turn away and protect herself from further heartbreak. But the memory of their connection, of the moments they'd shared, lingered, tugging at the walls she'd built around her heart. Slowly, she met his gaze, her expression softening. "This isn't going to be easy," she whispered. "Trust doesn't just come back overnight." "I know," he replied, his voice steady. "But I'll do whatever it takes to earn it. No more lies, no more secrets. Just us." The vulnerability in his eyes, The raw honesty left her breathless, and in that moment, she realized that despite everything, she wanted to give him that chance. She wanted to believe that redemption was possible, not just for him, but for herself as well. Taking a deep breath, she reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Then let's try, one step at a time. His hand tightened around hers, and a flicker of hope lit his gaze, softening the shadows that had haunted him. And as they stood there in the quiet park, hands entwined, Izzy felt the first glimmers of a new beginning, a fragile but undeniable chance to rebuild what had been broken. In that moment, she knew that their journey was far from over, but they would face it together. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act, one step at a time, as Izzy and Nico tried to rebuild the fragile trust that had been shattered. True to his word, Nico handed over everything he had on Leclerc International and other companies he had investigated. Izzy had asked to see it all, not to protect her family's name, but to understand the full scope of what they were up against. Some of the findings were shocking, even to her. There were deals she'd never heard of, acquisitions made at the expense of small businesses, partnerships that had left a trail of bankruptcies and job losses. It was hard to face, to acknowledge that her family's empire was built on more than just innovation and hard work. Yet each discovery made her resolve to change things even stronger. As she pored over the files late into the night, Nico often sat beside her, guiding her through the labyrinth of corruption and greed. Their conversations were no longer tinged with anger or suspicion. Instead, a quiet understanding had taken root between them, a shared goal, a commitment to making things right. There was something profound about working side by side, united by purpose and forgiveness. Together they found a rhythm, a way of communicating that didn't require words. She found herself looking forward to those hours, to the quiet strength he offered, to the way his presence filled the room with a calm, steady warmth. But the real test came when Izzy decided to take action. She was determined to put everything she'd learned to use, to confront her family and the board about the practices that had hurt so many. It was a daunting task, one that would require her to risk her own position within Leclerc International. Yet, with Nico's support, she felt a courage she hadn't known before. One evening, as they reviewed a particularly damning document, Nico reached across the table and took her hand, his gaze steady. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly. She looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I know," she whispered, "and I'm so glad you're here." The day of the board meeting dawned gray and overcast, the sky reflecting the weight of what lay ahead. Izzy walked into the boardroom with her head held high, her gaze steady as she faced her family and the board members. They'd expected her to come with ideas for expansion, for new ways to increase profits. Instead, she came armed with the truth. "I know some of you won't like what I have to say," she began, her voice clear and resolute. "But our company's growth has come at a cost that's been hidden behind our success. Today, that changes." She laid out the evidence, the deals that had destroyed lives and livelihoods, the acquisitions that had taken advantage of people who couldn't fight back. She saw the shock in her family's eyes, the disbelief from some, the quiet shame from others. And as she spoke, she felt her fear begin to fade, replaced by a fierce sense of purpose. "I'm proposing a new direction," she continued, "one that prioritizes integrity and responsibility. We can no longer turn a blind eye to the impact of our actions. It's time we build a legacy we can truly be proud of." When she finished, the room fell into stunned silence. Her father's longtime friend and board chair, Mr. Remington, cleared his throat, his eyes somber as he met her gaze. "This is unexpected, Isabella. But you're right. We've ignored these issues for too long." One by one, the board members began to murmur their agreement. And for the first time, Izzy felt a sense of hope, a belief that real change was possible. She had stepped into the role she'd once feared, not as a puppet for the family name, but as a leader who understood the weight of her responsibility. As the meeting concluded, she felt a wave of relief, a lightness that was new and exhilarating. She had done it. She had faced her family's legacy and set a new course. Outside the boardroom, Nico was waiting for her, a quiet smile on his face. She walked toward him, her heart full, and without a word, wrapped her arms around him. He held her close, his embrace warm and steady, and in that moment, she knew she had found a true partner, someone who saw her, believed in her, and stood by her. "It's done," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and relief. "We did it." He pulled back slightly, his eyes meeting hers with a look of pure admiration. "You did it, Izzy. I'm so proud of you." She smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you." They stood in silence for a moment, their hands intertwined, their connection stronger than ever. And in that quiet space, they both knew that they had found something rare and beautiful. A love that had been forged in the fires of betrayal. A bond built on trust and forgiveness. A few weeks later, Izzy and Nico found themselves back in Amsterdam. This time not as adversaries, but as partners. They spent their days exploring the city, savoring the freedom of a life without secrets, without the shadows of their past mistakes. They laughed, shared stories, and let themselves imagine a future that was theirs alone. One evening, as they strolled along the canals, Nico took her hand, his gaze serious yet full of warmth. "Izzy, I don't know where this road will lead us," he said softly, "but I know I want to be by your side. Whatever comes next, I want us to face it together." Her heart swelled with emotion, and she squeezed his hand, feeling the truth of his words resonate within her. "I feel the same," she whispered. "No more running, no more games. Just us, building something real." He smiled, a look of pure contentment softening his features. And as they stood there, watching the lights reflect off the water, Izzy felt a sense of peace she'd never known before. She had found love, not in the security of wealth or power, but in the vulnerability of opening herself to someone who had once been her enemy. Together, they had created something stronger than either of them could have imagined. Their pasts would always be a part of them, but it no longer defined them. They had chosen a new path, a path that held the promise of love, redemption, and a future they would face together. And as they walked hand in hand into the night, Izzy knew that they had finally found their way home. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. Check this video out too. This billionaire's life is under attack. A dangerous stalker threatens her empire, her fortune, and her safety. So she hires a deadly ex-military bodyguard to protect her.